Another good life.
Another good life.
And we have got a good guest.
We do.
We're talking to Jennifer Shaw. And she's written a book, Life Not Typical. But it's going to be a blessing to you.
It will. Trust
now,
me.
if you don't have children, or if your children are grown, it's still going to help you. It'll help you with a neighbor. It'll help you with children you see in your neighborhood. I believe I tell you, it's a help to me. I read that book and I thought, wow, now I can help somebody that's got a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old.
I felt the same way. If you feel like you have a special needs child, or you know somebody that's concerned about things they're seeing in their child, you might want to watch this program. You want to watch it anyway. It'll build your faith up. I'm telling you, won't it, honey?
Yep. Life Not Typical. And it is a pleasure to have you today.
Well, thank you.
We're going to talk about this and help some of you.
That's right.
And that's really the reason she wrote the book, was that you might be helped.
That's right.
Or someone you know might be helped. Jennifer, want to find out a little about your life, and though if they get the book, they'll know a little about your life. But when did you start operatic singing?
You know, I started off as a pianist. I was a classical pianist. That's my undergraduate degree.
Oh.
And when I went up to audition for piano, my choir director said, why don't you audition for voice at the same time? And I said, I don't want to sing. And he said, well, just try it, just see, because you might get money, you know. So I auditioned, and I got a scholarship in voice. And I was actually really mad, because I had worked so hard on my piano audition, but I got the money for voice. So I had to study voice to keep my scholarship. And by about my junior year of college, I felt like the Lord was making it very clear to me that He'd rather have me head in that direction. And so that was my backdoor way. But I've been studying classical music since I was 6 years old.
Oh,
and then I did my graduate work in opera.
Hmm.
So
Well, you were raised in a Christian home.
I was.
And you went off to college, and you kind of got out on your own for a while.
I did. I had wonderful parents who loved the Lord, but I was pretty rebellious. I know it sounds funny to be a rebellious opera singer, but when I was 15, I just said, you know, there are a lot of things I want to do, and I don't think God's going to have anything to do with that, so I don't want anything to do with God. And I'm not real proud of that time of my life, but I just walked away. And it was when I was about 20 that I realized, you know, a lot of people come to the Lord because they have a very broken story. I didn't have that. I had gotten everything I wanted. I'd made all these goals, and I'd achieved them, and I realized that life was still empty. And I thought, you know, who's really happy in the world? Who actually is truly happy and not just pretending all the time?
Right.
And it was my parents.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, maybe they do know something after all. And that was when I recommitted my life to the Lord. And
tell about how you met your husband.
Oh,
I think
was
that's
sweet.
neat.
Yeah, he and I were in choir together. He was the bass next door. And I knew he was a Christian because he was involved in a Christian group on our campus. And I knew when I recommitted my life, I'd need to find some Christian friends, or I was never going to make it. And so I asked him where he went to church one day at rehearsal, and he said, well, I'll take you with me if you want. And we went to church that Sunday, and that was the end. Yeah, he's been my best friend ever since.
Well,
So.
that's beautiful. Well, you had a little boy named Toby.
Yeah.
And tell us about his life, and really that's what the book is about. It's mainly about Toby.
That's right.
And he doesn't realize, even at this point, what a testimony he is.
He doesn't know. We have
Yeah.
3 children. We have 2 girls, and then Toby is our youngest.
Right.
So we have Rena and Rachel, and then Toby. And yeah, Toby is 7 now, and I'm really excited to see how the Lord will use him in his life. But when he was little, we were going through a very hard time. My dad was dying of Lou Gehrig's disease, which is a very difficult thing to go through, and I was so close to my dad. I'm very close to both of my parents, and while my dad was ill, Toby's behavior was starting to get really strange. And that last summer that Dad was alive, Toby was a toddler. You know, he wasn't quite 2 years old, and that was when things started getting very bizarre. And he couldn't, you know, if he got a drop of water on him, he would start screaming like he was being burned. And if we took him outside and there was a breeze, he would panic and he'd cry and he'd try to climb up and hide in my clothes. He couldn't eat. He didn't communicate at all. You know, babies learn to babble and then they learn to talk, and he never did that. He cried, and he cried for years. It was so difficult.
At 6 months, that's when you realized something was wrong.
Yeah, and you know, in hindsight, we were misled by a few things. He'd had some extreme ear infections, and he was in pain a lot, and he couldn't hear well. So we were thinking, well, you know, he's not learning to talk because he can't hear, or he's, you know, always crying because his ears hurt. But as time went on, at 6 months, I think our main things were he would never eat food. That sounds so silly, but we tried to start him on baby food, and he just simply couldn't. He couldn't do it. He would gag, he would cry, he just couldn't eat. And he did everything a little late, you know, but even then, there were many days we thought, oh, everything's fine, he just had a bad day. But as he got older, it got more and more extreme, to the point that, you know, he would be panicking at the thought of going outside, and that's not okay.
Yeah.
Now, if he didn't eat, what did you do?
Well, he was on supplements. I mean, we had to hold him down and use a medicine dropper and squirt them down his throat. I mean, he had a few foods that he would eat. He had 4 foods that he would eat. He would eat dry Rice Krispies and dry Cheerios. He would eat round, prepackaged peanut butter crackers, and he would eat graham crackers. But he didn't have any protein, he didn't have any fruit or vegetable or anything like that. And so nutritionally, I mean, we just were like, this isn't, but I mean, it wasn't like he was being, you know, stubborn. He would gag, he would try to throw up. He really just couldn't eat it. And we didn't know why. So he, you know, we'd have to hold him down and use these supplements, and, you know, it was terrible. It really was.
When did he actually talk?
Well, that's such a sweet story. You know, my father passed away, and 2 weeks later was Toby's 2nd birthday. So I was in terrible grief at the time, and it was pretty much on his 2nd birthday that he was diagnosed, and his diagnosis is sensory processing disorder, which is a neurological condition where his brain was misinterpreting sensory input. So for him, if he got water on him, his brain told him he was being burned. It would be misinterpreted. Or the breeze felt like it was, they described it like sparks on his skin, and when he ate, it felt like it was cutting his mouth, so he couldn't eat. And we got him into therapy at 2 years old, pretty much on his birthday. And there's no medication or drugs. It's just occupational therapy, play-based.
Could you go back and talk about how that all happened? Because these are miracles that happened along the way.
Yeah.
Because you ran into that lady at the swimming pool. I mean, we want you guys to know God orders our steps, and He does miracles, and He's no respecter of persons. So you really felt like that was a divine appointment at the swimming pool. God had made sure, because if that lady had not been there, that acquaintance from high school, then all the other wouldn't have transpired.
It wouldn't have happened. Well, that's exactly right, because we were, at that time, my father's life was ending, and he was just suffering. And I was overwhelmed. And so we just didn't even know what to do. We knew we were losing Dad. We felt we were losing Toby. You know, every day we woke up, he was worse. And we didn't know what to do. And I ran into an acquaintance at the swimming pool. And she had 2 boys, and one of them was acting differently. And then she mentioned that he was autistic, and that had been what was in my mind the whole time, is Toby autistic? And I had said to her, how did you know? You know, because Toby's not speaking. And she was the one who said, hey, do you know about these federal programs? In fact, there's a lot of information in my book about how to get help, because we wanted our book to be for people, this meeting at the pool, you know, that this is, and she told me who to contact and how to start the whole process of getting him tested and diagnosed and getting him into therapy. And it was a miracle, because the whole process should have taken close to a year to get him through all the testing and diagnosis, and we had so many appointments just miraculously become available. He did the whole thing in a month.
But would you tell him how you made an appointment, and every single one of them would like, okay, yeah, but in 4 months.
Yeah,
you needed 12 appointments, but all of them needed 3 or 4 months. There was such a backlog.
Yeah, and they would say, well, we can get you in November. And then they would say, oh, wait a minute. Well, somebody canceled tomorrow morning. Do you want that?
And that
I'd say
happened
yes.
12 times.
And it happened 12 times in a row. We got through the entire testing process, which should have taken a year. It took less than a month. And from the start to his starting therapy and a diagnosis. And then you asked about his speaking, and for me, that's one of my favorite memories, and it will probably make me cry, but he was not saying anything. He had no sounds. And we got him into therapy, and about 6 weeks into therapy, he and I were reading his bedtime story. He was sitting on my lap. Every night I would read a story to him, and then I would pray with him, and I would hug him and tell him I loved him and put him to bed. And that night I read the story, and I prayed with him, and I told him I loved him, and he turned around in my lap, and he patted my cheek, and he just, out of nowhere, he just said, I love you, Mom. And it was completely slurry. You know, he had no coordination in his mouth, but I understood him clear as day. And I think I scared him to death, because I started sobbing, you know, and I thought, no, I want you to think it's a good thing to talk. Never mind, I'm happy. But for me, that's a memory I will just cherish forever. And by Christmas, you know, because we never knew if we'd ever hear those words. I mean, at the time, I thought, will he ever be functional? Will he? Because he was worse every day, and you just thought, will he ever leave my home? Will he ever be able to love anyone other than us? I mean, we knew he loved us, but you know, we didn't know what the end outcome would be.
But you couldn't leave him with anybody.
No, not ever.
You couldn't leave him with grandmommy, granddaddy, aunts, uncles,
He
neighbors.
wouldn't let anybody touch him but my husband and myself. And we did ask a therapist later, we said, why can we touch him and no one else can touch him? And she said, well, you know, every time when your baby's an infant, every time they react or whatever, you adjust what you're doing and you don't think about it. And she said, think about how you respond to Toby. And she was right. There were very specific ways Nathan and I would touch or handle Toby that we knew didn't bother him. And many things we didn't do that we knew would, like, he couldn't take light touch at all. It felt like it was burning him, light touch. And you know, many people will look at a little baby and they'll ruffle their hair or run their fingers down their and he would be terrified. But we realized, oh wait, we never do that, because we knew he hated it. And so he just wouldn't go with anyone else. So for us as parents, it was pretty relentless. I mean, we never got a break. So, but you know, you'll do that for your child. People say, well, how did you have the patience? And I said, well, God gives you what you need. I mean, I'm not going to lie, we were exhausted. But God gives you what you need to do what He's given you to do, and He gave us this child, and He gave us what we needed to help him.
You know, I really wanted to get this in, just for the people that are watching, that your pediatrician really wanted you to wait, didn't she?
Yeah.
But I like what you said in your book. You really need to go with your instincts.
Yeah. My pediatrician told me later that they actually are often trained that, you know, parents will worry too much or whatever, and they're sort of trained to tell them to wait. But all of the science at this point points to just the extreme importance of early intervention. What what we haven't said is that Toby is now completely healed. He's 7 years old, and he's perfectly fine. And I really think it was a blessing that he was so severe that we had to get him into therapy early. But that early intervention is so critical that all the therapists will tell you, don't wait, don't give it 6 months, don't give it 3 months, you know. And if you go and you get testing and you find out that there's nothing to worry about, that's wonderful. But if you wait on the testing and there was something to worry about, you've lost a really critical time period. And you know, parents usually know first because they're with their kids all day, every day. You have to trust your gut and your instinct. And I think you know, the Holy Spirit who's telling you, you might need to go check this out.
That's right.
You know, a lot of parents, you just don't, well, you're probably like Jennifer was, you know, we'll just let it go another week or 2 weeks or something like that. You can't let it go. You've got to react as soon as you have any instinct that there's something wrong. Well, you've got some questions.
Well,
there,
I did. I just wanted to talk about your father. You know, you were so close to him when he was dying, and you wanted to do a very special CD for him.
Yeah.
And you did it.
Yeah.
And that's where you met John, who was the producer?
Yeah, he was my first producer.
Yeah.
We never intended, I never thought I'd be doing any of what I'm doing now. I was a opera voice professor at Cedarville University. I was singing with the opera. I never thought I'd do this, and I took a church job and was, that church asked me to help them transition contemporary, which I thought I'd be awful at and told them so. But they asked me to pray about it. And when my dad was ill, and I had started writing music for the band at the church, and when my dad was ill, he loved me to death. He was not a big opera fan. And I wanted him to have it before he died. So that was how we started doing this. I made him a contemporary album of the things I'd written for the band, but I never thought anyone would hear it. It was just supposed to be for Dad. And then we found out within like 6 or 9 months it had gone, we had music on just hundreds and hundreds of little tiny radio stations everywhere, all over the world. We were getting mail from South Africa and Thailand, and that was amazing. And I think the way God brought Romans 8:28 to life out of that situation, that he was using it for good.
That's right.
But yeah, right before Dad died, he wanted me to sing at his memorial, and I knew I was not going to be able to sing on that day. And so I wrote him a song and recorded it for him so that we could play it. But John, who is such a sweet man, he had been moving his studio, and I called to say, you know, hospice has said we have a couple weeks, can I come record? And he just said, okay. And he never told me they were moving the studio. And he and his partner had stayed up all night the night before I got there to try to set things up enough for me to do that song, and they never told me. I found out later. It was just such a sweet gesture just to let me get that song done for my dad.
Well, you did it, and he gave you some advice before he died.
Yeah, he did.
I wrote that down.
Yeah, the night I went and played him the recording, toward the end of his life, he was going into a coma, and he was so short on oxygen he couldn't often talk. But that night he was lucid and he was all there, and I played him the song, and he said to me, and he was very intense that night. He was, you know, normally a very easygoing guy, but he was very intense, and he just said, honey, when this is successful, I want you to remember that you always need to put God first, and you always need to put your family second, and protect your family, because he said nothing is going to be worth getting that confused. And I just said, Dad, you know, I don't think, I mean, thank you, but I don't think we're going to see a lot of big success. And he said, no. He said, the Lord's going to use this, and you need to remember that you always put God first, and you always protect your family.
Amen.
Oh, that's good.
And you've never forgotten that.
Well, I don't think, you know, he and my mom set such an example of God and family for me. I don't think it would be possible to forget. You know, that was him in his love as my parent. wanting to make sure he'd said what he had to say, but he didn't realize he'd said it with his whole life. I'll cry.
Yeah.
You can't forget things that your parents have shown you in that way.
Well, getting back to the school that Toby went to, CHSC, there was something there that really helped you a lot, and that was an observation room.
Yes, yeah. So Toby, when he was 2, and he started school at Columbus Speech and Hearing Center, I can't say it either, CSHC, and they had this intensive therapy program that addressed speech and also sensory issues, so it was the perfect place for Toby. But in every classroom they had an observation room, and also in the occupational therapy gym they had an observation room that had one-way glass. So I could watch Toby, but he didn't know I was watching, and all the parents could sit in there and watch and learn what was working for their children and what the therapists were doing, because it was like preschool. It was like regular preschool, but it was taught by an early intervention specialist and a speech therapist and an occupational therapist, and so we could watch what they were doing. And so we could reproduce everything they were doing at home in our house. And that was, you know, I think critical, because so many therapists will say, you know, the parents expect us to, in a half an hour or an hour a week, to be able to fix their kids, but they don't understand, like, they're with their kids all the time. If they were doing it at home, how much more progress you'd see.
Yeah.
And so my husband and I just started trying to recreate everything in our own house that they were doing there.
And the reason was because, according to the book, the observation room.
Yeah,
you got
because
to
we
see
could see it.
firsthand. So you spent many hours in there, and you also got to talk with other parents.
Yeah.
You all became close. Your kids played together because they played together in the school. They understood each other.
Yeah, yeah, and it was so nice. You know, I think a lot of special needs parents would agree with me. You often feel very alone. It feels like you're the only person who has a child like this. And, you know, everybody else's kids are doing this or that, and your kid is not. And yet in that room, when you're meeting other parents and you're going, oh, wait, like, you know, you understand, and we'd share, you know, somebody would come in and say, well, I found a t-shirt that my kid can wear, you know, and we'd all be like, what, you know, and we'd all go buy the same, so then we'd laugh that they were all in the same clothes. But, you know, it was a way to connect and a support, and to know that you weren't alone. That other people were going through what you were
And
going
Jennifer,
through.
these children all had the same
No.
things? I mean, they could all wear a certain t-shirt or...
Well, no. The school was specifically for speech delay, but the statistics are pretty amazing how many children with a speech delay are suffering with sensory processing disorder, because when you think about it, the information that your brain gets from your senses, that's sort of the foundation for all your learning, because it tells you where you are in space, it tells you what's going on around you, and if you can't process that information, you just don't learn other things. And so a lot of kids, the first thing that parents notice is they're not speaking. Well, they're not speaking because sometimes because there's a physical reason or something else, but sometimes they're not speaking because they have a sensory processing disorder. And so at this school, there were 8 children in Toby's class, and 6 of them had sensory disorders. Now, Toby's was by far the most severe. And we also saw, though, as they addressed his sensory concerns, he had pretty miraculous progress in speech. I mean, by the end of that year, he was above average for his age group in speech. He went from no sounds to above average, but it was because he was sort of locked in his body. And you can also experience it in 2 ends of a spectrum. In Toby's case, they call it over-responsive. His brain was hypersensitive and over-responding to input. So like water becomes burning. You can be on the other end where you don't feel things enough or you don't sense things enough. And those kids, some of those kids, if it's very extreme, they don't even feel pain. So they might be injured and not know it. But you might see a child like with Toby who can't eat, or the other end would be a child who's very messy and they're trying to, you know, shove food in their mouth and get it all just to feel something, because they're not having that sensation of taste or touch. So it can be on either end. So the kids in his classroom, we had both, and it was kind of funny because, you know, a couple of the kids are trying to hug everybody and jump on everything and throw everything, and a couple of the kids are trying to stay like right like this and be neat. And it got
That was
kind
funny.
of it got kind of amusing.
Toby had a friend like that. They liked playing with each other because they understood each other.
He had one other little buddy with a very similar situation, and they loved to play together because they knew, we're going to play with blocks, we're going to be very neat, we're not going to touch each other, we'll turn and smile every once in a while, and then the other kids, are taking the Play-Doh and smashing it through their hair and stuff, so it got to be kind of amusing. The parents, we'd sit back there and laugh and feel bad that we were laughing, but it was pretty funny.
I wanted to get this in. You read a book called The Out of Sync Child. Did that help you a lot?
It helped a lot. There's very little. SPD is kind of a new diagnosis. I think honestly, a lot of children would be diagnosed as autistic previous to this understanding, because every child with autism has SPD, but you can have SPD and not necessarily be autistic. But that was one of the first books written. It's by Carol Stock-Kranowitz, and she wrote this book called The Out of Sync Child. And after reading it, I just understood so much more. I mean, we were saying it changed our parenting completely, because before, like for us, one of the most confusing things Toby did was he would be in the car and he'd be fine, and then we'd park and he would just start to sob and panic, and we'd be like, but not every day. Some days he would, some days he wouldn't. I'm thinking, what's going on? And when I would say, what's wrong? He'd point at the trees. I'm like, why are you afraid of a tree? That doesn't make any sense at all. And then we realized after reading the book, wind was hurting him. And when we parked the car, if the trees were blowing, he knew we had to get out and it was going to hurt. But he couldn't tell us. And so all of a sudden, so many of these confusing things that he had been doing made sense, and so we could help him then. It gave us, it just made it possible to parent so much better. So if we were stopping and it was windy, I could say, hey, but before we get out of the car, buddy, we're going to put on your jacket, we're going to zip it up, you can put your face in my shoulder so it doesn't hurt, and we'll run right in. And he knew we understood, so he started to calm down, because it wasn't going to be so bad, and it just helped everything. It really did.
Well, you prayed all the way through, didn't you?
Oh, I did.
And I really want to get that in here.
Oh, I did.
What was the name of that book?
The Out of Sync Child by Carol Kranowitz.
Yeah, and there's also, she has another that she wrote later called The Out of Sync Child Has Fun, and that's just full of ideas. Actually, it's basically home therapy, but it's ideas for how to play with your child to help support them making new connections in their brain.
There's one thing, if there are parents out there, and I think there are a lot that go, I just don't know, I don't want to do this because I don't want anybody to think my child's different, so they don't do anything. What would you say to the parent that says, I don't want my child labeled?
Yeah, I hear that all the time. And for us, I would say, by labeling my son as a special needs child, we were able to get him the help that he needed so that he will never be labeled again. Now, I don't know if that is not the outcome for everybody, but pretending something isn't happening, and that's so human. We don't want anything to be wrong with our children, but pretending that it's not happening doesn't change it if it's there. And so what we found too was, especially in school, the teachers would say, give us a helpful label. Because a kid with sensory processing disorder, when I say to his teacher, hey, he has sensory processing disorder, he's going to be, if he falls on the playground and he seems to overreact, it's because he feels pain more strongly. Well, if I didn't tell her that, she's going to think, wow, that kid's real dramatic, or that kid's trying to get a bunch of attention, or, when he can't sit very well in circle, they're going to think that child is disruptive, that child is disobedient. It gets them labels anyway. They're just not the right labels that will help them do a better job with your child.
Now, what happens if you never did anything and he grows up 7, 10?
Well,
is it ever too late?
I don't know if it's never too late to improve, but there is definitely a window of opportunity where it's much easier to improve when they're young. There's all kinds of studies and science behind this early intervention window of 0 to 3 years. Now, I will say, because I don't want parents to get discouraged, many children are not diagnosed with SPD until they're 7 or 8 years old. Therapy is always helpful. In Toby's case, though, he was so severe, and he was already developing all kinds of phobias and other issues because he was so afraid of everything. I don't think we would have a very different outcome if we had not intervened early with him. But there is always hope, and the vast majority of children are diagnosed later and they still do get help, and it still does help. It's just not as effective.
Amen. And I wanted to point out one thing in this book. There are pages and pages of help for you to get. Now, all you have to do is buy the book, and you can get it any place, I presume.
Yeah, Amazon or jennifershaw.com, wherever books are sold.
I just thought that was a great part of the book, to tell people, is your child experiencing these symptoms?
Yeah.
And you go through all the sensories. I just thought
we
that was
have
great.
a symptoms list. We have a list of all the, well, not all of, but several national places that you can go for help with diagnosis, treatment, therapy. We had several interviews with therapists because we thought if you read it just to read our story, and many people do, that's great. But if you read it and you recognize that you might need to take some further steps, we wanted you to have some resources to do it.
Yeah.
Great.
So.
And there are even conversation with occupational therapists. On that, and there's so much more. But you need to get the book if you're going to help somebody, because there's a lot of helps in that book.
There are. Well, you went to Kenya.
We did.
Toby did great, didn't he?
Toby did great. It was amazing. We got to take the whole family. And, you know, here's my boy who couldn't go outside and couldn't eat, and we took him to a place that's pretty extreme outside, and he had to eat Kenyan food, and he loved it, actually. He did wonderfully. And one of the pictures we have in here is him feeding a giraffe. So my kid who couldn't even get touched, and, you know, the giraffe tongue is like sucking the food right off his hand, and he thought it was gross, but he thought it was really funny, and he kept doing it. He did wonderfully.
I would say he's healed.
I would say the same thing.
And there may be somebody out there and they don't know Jesus. What would you say to somebody that says, I don't know Jesus?
I would say that you don't know what you're missing.
I would too.
I mean, what I have, because I have really tried it both ways, and I have to say, you know, people say, this is a little maybe precocious to say, but you say to people, you want to know the meaning of life. Our whole meaning of life is to get this right. Why are we here? To get this right. If you don't know the Lord, you're missing the whole point. We're here to know Him and to make Him known.
That's right.
And He was everything we ever needed in a very dark time, and He's everything we need when things are great, too.
Amen.
Amen.
He is all you need. And if you don't know Him, this is your opportunity to say, Jesus, come in to my heart. Make me over anew. We thank you